Chapter 23. The Tale of Sheila, Sheila, the Half-Wood Elf. The Tale of Sheila, the Half-Wood Elf. Sheila was the daughter of a wood elf mother, Shay, and a human father, Tarsus, a pairing that had never happened before, for wood elves do not associate with non-wood elves unless absolutely necessary. Wood elves keep to themselves in the forests and basically live in isolation, away from all other humanoid creatures, but fight with goblins quite often, since goblins mostly live in forests too, and because goblins are evil. Wood elves are creatures of the forest who also worship forests, like druids worship nature. Forests are sacred to them, so they consider killing goblins to be their sacred duty. To a wood elf, killing a goblin is like casting out a demon from someone it had possessed. With each goblin killed, the forest is cleansed, and the wood elf would slowly grow in power and rank. Sheila would grow up in two worlds, as a wood elf in the forest, but mostly in her father's world, where the only wood elf around was her mother. Despite her mother's sin of sleeping with a human, Shay was of high noble birth, and Tarsus was considered the greatest human warrior in the land. That, and he and his party of adventurers, had just recently saved the lives of the wood elves by slaying all manner of giants that had invaded their forest, and would have surely wiped them out had Shay not contacted Tarsus through her great magical and mystical powers. Tarsus and his party wiped out the giants and sent them scattering to the winds. The wood elves were thankful and even gracious, but were anxious for Tarsus and his fellow non-wood elves to leave, which he would have done right away, had he not fallen in love with Shay. Shay was not expecting to fall in love with Tarsus, despite how incredibly handsome and polite he was, for no female wood elf would ever think of such a thing. But no one plans to fall in love. It just happens, and in that moment, Shay knew that her people's ways were wrong, and that wood elves should learn how to get along with other races. She knew that her new ideas would be thoroughly rejected, but her high status made it impossible for her fellow wood elves to banish her. So Tarsus was allowed to stay, after many negotiations were made, mostly being that Shay must go be with Tarsus in his human world as often as possible. There, Shay's parents would visit her often, and over time learned that Shay was right, that wood elves needed to learn how to get along with other races. But sadly, such a change never came. Thus, Sheila grew up in both worlds and learned the ways of both humans and wood elves. Tarsus taught her to fight like a warrior with sword and shield, while Shay taught her the ways of the rogues and rangers and druids. Most wood elves were rangers and or rogues. Only a few were druids. The town where her father lived held a tournament every year, and Sheila and her mother loved watching Tarsus compete. He was the champion for many years, but one day he finally lost to a young warrior named Ezu. Losing affected him far more than it should have, for Ezu was a young and very powerful warrior, but some men have a very hard time accepting defeat, and Tarsus retired after losing and mostly went into seclusion, but kept training his daughter in the skills of a warrior, for something within him told him he must. Training with her mother and father, Sheila's powers grew as a ranger, rogue, and druid, but no one realized just how powerful she would one day become. Years later, her father, now quite old, became sick and died. The pain of losing Tarsus affected Sheila and her mother greatly, so they left the land of humans and went back to the forest and lived with the wood elves. There, Sheila would continue to train, but her training now intensified, for within her was a burning desire to return to the land of men and pay tribute to her father for all he had taught her. So one day, years later, she returned to her father's world and entered the tournament. The people were shocked to see Sheila enter the tournament. Everyone knew who she was, for who could forget the half-wood elf daughter of the greatest warrior in the land, let alone her wood elf mother, the only wood elf in town. No one thought they'd ever see her again, let alone see her enter the tournament. But to everyone's surprise, she somehow made it all the way to the final match. Her final opponent, of course, was Ezu. He had won every year since defeating Tarsus. Ezu, like Tarsus before him, was now considered the greatest warrior in the land. He was quite shocked to see Sheila, though, but smiled and congratulated her on getting this far, clearly implying this was as far as she'd go. But Sheila, who was usually very shy and rarely spoke, shot back, "Congratulations to you on getting this far as well," causing his smile to quickly disappear. No one could see how she could possibly have gotten to the final match, and everyone assumed it would end quickly, for how could a small, somewhat elvish-looking female have any chance against such a powerful warrior? But in a display of skill and cunning that would be talked about for many years, Sheila somehow found a way to defeat Ezu, and she became the new champion of the land. And that's when everything in her world changed. After the Wood Elves heard that Sheila had defeated the humans' champion in a tournament, they started to worship her as a demigoddess and called her Sheila after her mother. When the humans heard this, they mocked the Wood Elves by calling her Sheila, partly because of how shy she was, and partly because they thought it foolish to call her after her mother's name, let alone worship her as a demigoddess. But she defeated Ezu, which at the time seemed impossible. When the Wood Elves heard how the humans mocked them and called her Sheila, they ignored their mockery and instead started calling her Sheila, the Great Forest Elf, setting her apart from all the other Wood Elves, which only made her even more shy, as she did not want all the attention that came with her victory. So she secluded herself deeper into the forest, where she lived with her mother in isolation, away from the humans, and now also away from the Wood Elves. Ezu, in his anger and fury, trained relentlessly for years, but would never face Sheila again, as she would never enter that tournament again. Instead, she trained with her mother and also on her own. They became powerful rogues and druids, more skilled than anyone in the land, and her skills as a ranger were unmatched by any other Wood Elf. As the years went by, Sheila wondered if her mother would outlive her, since a Wood Elf lived much longer than a human. A half-Wood Elf did too, but not as long as a Wood Elf, much like a half-elf versus an elf. But her mother finally succumbed to death, and Sheila, using her powerful druidic magic, created a beautiful grove in the forest and buried her mother. Now alone, Sheila felt empty inside and didn't want anything to do with life anymore. Losing her mother was more pain than she could bear. So she decided that tomorrow she would work on creating a special elixir that would end her life. But her mother came to her in a dream that night and told her to travel back to her father's town and learn the mystical arts of wizards. She woke up weeping, seeing that it was just a dream, and started to work on creating her elixir. But she could not get the vision of her mother and her words out of her head. She ran through the forest to where she buried her mother and screamed through her tears, "Why? Why do you want me to do this? I don't want to live anymore. I'm done with life. I want to die." The silence was deafening. Chills and torment ran through her body, and she let out a wail that was heard throughout all of the forest. Even the Wood Elves who lived a couple miles away heard it, but had no clue who or what it was. Sheila got up, turned around, and started to walk slowly back home. The tears still running down her face, the pain still coursing through her veins, when suddenly she stopped and turned around and ran back to her mother's grave. "Fine, you win. How can I ignore your request? I will train and become a great wizard too, and I won't stop training until I die." Sheila would travel back to her father's town and train there with a local wizard for almost 10 years. Now old and knowing she didn't have much longer to live, she traveled back to her home and made arrangements with the wood elves to be buried next to her mother when she died. The half wood elf died 2 days later at the age of 188, and the wood elves buried her next to her mother, Shay. Sheila's ascension to a goddess and her creation of her first world. In death, Sheila eventually ascended to the status of a goddess, and, in time, set out to create her first world, Forestera. Unknown to her, Ezu had also ascended many years earlier and became the great god of mischief, Zeus, Ezu rearranged. But when he came to Forestera, he changed his name to Suez, Zeus backwards, to disguise himself. For many knew of Zeus, and he was rarely welcome in a god's domain, let alone their first creation. Most gods could never hide their identity by merely changing their name. But such was the cunning and magic of Zeus that everyone just assumed Suez was a new god, like Sheila, who stood against evil. So he was welcomed without question, as was the custom of the gods. For while some gods often delved in trickery and deceit, no one had ever conceived of such a plan of vengeance as Ezu had. A god's first creation and 1,000 years. When a god creates their first world, they are bound to that world for 1,000 years, after which they are free to roam anywhere they please, and even create more worlds if they wish. After 1,000 years, any god who has a domain in that world could challenge the new god's standing, if they so desired. This was only done if there was a good reason to do so. At that point, the creator of that world had two options: fight or concede, and negotiate a peace deal. Fight was rarely chosen, for if they were to lose, they would be banished from their world, and the challenger would steal their world from them. In negotiation, the god was usually bound for 100 more years and usually had to share creator status with the challenger, though every negotiation was unique, but that was how most negotiations went. Thus, a god rarely challenged the creator, unless they felt very confident they could win, thus forcing the creator to negotiate. The other reason a god rarely challenged, without just cause, was that it was considered very unethical and cruel to do so, and evil gods could never challenge, just as a good god could never challenge an evil god's creation. Suez, Zeus, however, conceived of the perfect trap, to finally have his vengeance against Sheila. Portraying himself as a lawful good deity, he swore to defeat evil at all costs. But when his followers killed evil creatures, those creatures somehow were sent to his domain and became his servants. No one knows how he achieved this. In this way, Suez built an army significantly larger and more powerful than any other deity's domain. All deities that came to a world were given a domain, territory, and created beings in that world. While Sheila was the creator of Forestera, the elven gods created the elves, the human gods the humans, etc. Sheila created wood elves, and she chose to create a few half-elves too, so that half-elves would exist from the beginning of her world. Normally, half-elves only came into existence when, on those very rare occasions, a human and an elf mated. Meanwhile, her mother Shay became an angelic spirit who served her daughter from another plane of existence that was unknown to Sheila. But her connection with her mother was so strong that this relationship continued, despite their different destinations and paths that they had chosen in death. Her father also became an angelic spirit and remains married to Shay for all eternity, for they are true soulmates and thus eternally linked, bonded. Fortunately for Sheila, she eventually came to learn that she was being double-crossed and who was doing it. This is the story of how she learned about it. A powerful human cleric of Suez was adventuring with a powerful half-elf wizard. In a dark passage, deep underground, below a temple to the evil goddess Tolona, they triggered a magical trap that released a mysterious-looking creature from the ethereal plane that, while visible, was very difficult to see. It began to speak to them threateningly, telling them that it would surely destroy them if they did not leave immediately. The wizard decided to cast Mordenkainen's faithful hound to help fight it, since it can see ethereal creatures, while the cleric, who had a magical ring that allowed him to cast wizard spells off of scrolls, decided to cast a polymorph other spell from a scroll, hoping that turning it into a snail would render it completely harmless. Unfortunately for them, the creature was also casting a powerful spell, which shot forth dark energy at the cleric, mortally wounding him, just as his polymorph spell went off. The dark energy that hit the cleric also hit the wizard just as his spell went off, causing a bizarre rift in space, which ended up not only mortally wounding the half-elf too, but it somehow polymorphed the Mordenkainen hound and the half-elf into a blending of both. Even more bizarre was that the dark energy then shot forth from both of them, back at the creature, killing it in a wild blaze of dark energy. As he and the cleric lay there dying, he saw what he assumed was a hallucination, but now knows that it wasn't. Dark energy rose from the now dead ethereal creature and took the form of a human and approached the cleric. Standing over him, he said the following: "I am your god, Suez, though that is not my actual name, but you have served me well. So I have chosen to let you see me in my glory before you pass on to the next world. Sadly, it won't be with me, though. But luckily, in addition to giving me all the evil creatures you have killed over the years to serve me in my army, you have now given me a most powerful ally. This evil entity will serve me well in my war against Sheila, though you would know her as Sheila, or is it Sheila? We both have so many names now that I get confused sometimes. But soon I will finally have my vengeance, and you have played a great part in it. I just wanted you to know that before you go meet whatever god you'll be meeting. Oh, I guess I can tell you, 'cause why not? His name is Hieronius. I'm sure you've heard of him. He's just another one of these do-gooders that just make me want to throw up. Mischief is so much more fun." With that, he disappeared, and they both died. The half-elf awoke in a different world. He was laying outside on the grass nearby Sheila's temple. He had died and gone to heaven, essentially, since he worshipped Sheila, which is why he recognized her temple. But heaven wasn't quite what he thought it would be like. Of course, he didn't think he'd be turned into a half-hound, half-elf thing either. As he laid there, still somewhat dazed and confused, he heard a voice. "Well, hello there. What's your name?" Looking up, he saw a beautiful-looking female that was unlike anything he had ever seen before. At first, he thought she was a half-elf like him, but then he noticed the different colors of yellow and brown and green streaks that swirled through her skin. "I am Baal," he said as he got to his feet. "I am a wizard and follower of the goddess Sheila. Please forgive my appearance. I'll try my best to explain. But first, may I know your name?" Sheila walked right up to him, stopping inches from his face with a big smile on hers. "I'm Sheila." After Baal regained consciousness, having passed out upon realizing he was standing next to his goddess, he explained all that happened to him. Oddly, she would find that, for reasons unknown, she was unable to reverse the magic that had turned him into the half-hound creature that he now was. But when she learned who Suez actually was and what he was doing, something that did not take her very long to figure out after hearing Baal's story, she immediately consulted with some of the other gods in her world, only to learn there was nothing she could do to stop him, for the god who was double-crossing her hadn't technically done anything wrong. Her best option was to wait until the 1,000 years had ended and let him make his move and decide then what course of action would be best. But she knew if she did nothing that she'd regret it. So she went to work to try to come up with a plan to defeat or at least stop Zeus. For if Zeus were to challenge her after the 1,000 years had ended, something that she just felt he was going to do, she could not possibly take up his challenge if his army of loyal servants was far greater than her own. Taking on Zeus one-on-one was dangerous enough. Taking him on with an army 2 or 3 times greater than her own would be suicide. For clarity, a god's army consisted of those who served them directly, along with all who died in the world of mortals who worshipped them, and thus went to their heaven. Heaven being either the domain of the god who created the world, or the domain of a god who was allowed to have their own domain in said world. The Creator chose which gods were allowed to have a domain of their own, though usually when a god came to your world, seeking their own domain therein, they were welcomed with open arms. The more gods, the merrier. After many months, Sheila had finally come up with a most bizarre and insane plan, which was to beat Zeus at his own game. But to do so, she had to first figure out how he was able to cause evil creatures to go to his domain when they were killed, rather than to an evil god's domain, which is where all evil creatures go when they die, and then do the same thing that Zeus did, but with good creatures instead, sending them to her domain rather than to the god who created them. But even if she figured out how to do that, how could she convince others that killing good creatures had to be done in order to help her stop Zeus from taking over her world? It all sounded quite insane, but she felt that she had no other choice and had to at least try it and hope that it would all somehow work out in the end. It took a couple years, but eventually she figured it all out. First, though, she would plant powerful, hidden, magical messages in Forestera that cryptically conveyed what a deity was doing in such a way so that Zeus wouldn't know she was onto him. And she'd also create a place that adventurers would find over time in an attempt to find the best and most powerful adventurers to help her in her plan. But to trick Zeus, the master of trickery, she'd have to be extremely careful and extremely cryptic. For now, though, it was time to build a special magical place to test adventurers, to challenge them, to see if any were up to her challenges. Once finished, Sheila could then only wait and watch and see what would unfold. A couple years later. Baal. What do you call this place? Sheila. The Caves of Ordered Randomness. Baal. You need to work on your naming of things. Sheila picked up a stick and threw it. Go fetch it, boy! Baal felt his body jerk towards the stick while his tongue slid out of his mouth. Dropping to all fours, he started to run towards the stick and then immediately stopped, got up, walked back over, and stood next to her. Baal. Funny. Very funny. You're enjoying this. He glanced at her. Aren't you? Sheila, with quite the smirk on her face. Yep,